Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on the History Valley podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Nina Livesey and Professor Bruce Chilton. This video is a debate in which Bruce and Nina will be debating, did Paul the Apostle actually exist, and did he compose the 7 authentic letters of Paul? Now, primarily, it's going to be centered on, did Paul write the 7 letters or not? But that will also entail, in part, did Paul exist or not as a historical figure? That will come up from time to time during the debate. And I'll have the links to purchase Nina Livesey's book, The Letters of Paul in the Roman Literary Context, and Bruce Chilton's book, Rabbi Paul, an Intellectual Biography. Both will be linked in the description below and the pinned comment. And with that being said, Nina and Bruce, thank you for joining me today.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah. And
thanks for setting this up.
Yeah, of course, and thank you both for allowing me to moderate this debate. So I want to start off with the introductory argument. We're going to go for 10 minutes. And Nina, you'll go first. I'll start the timer now.
Okay. Thank you, Jacob. So after careful review of the scholarship on the modern history of the question of authenticity, modern Pauline epistolary scholarship, Pauline collection theories, and Pauline chronologies and historical studies, I was both surprised and struck by the abundance of flawed methodologies, especially in the form of circular reasoning, a high degree of confidence regarding the historical reliability of letter content, idealism, and all of this coupled with a very high regard for the Apostle Paul. At the same time, I was equally struck by an overall lack of external evidence for the 7 letters dated to the mid-1st century for Paul or Paulos and for the community addressees. Thus, I concluded from this initial research that the authentic perspective, which Jacob is talking about in the background here, is inadequately or even hardly substantiated, not well substantiated. My investigation led me at first, and at the very least, to consider that the letters are something other than genuine correspondence from the Apostle Paul. Perhaps an example from one of my areas of inquiry will serve to illustrate the type of scholarship I encountered and my estimation of the kind of reasoning I found. Collection theories were one avenue of investigation, as I mentioned. As you know, these theories attempt to account for a collection of Pauline letters. This is because our early and indeed our only extant evidence of Pauline letters is in the form of a collection. Manuscript evidence of the letters is only that of collected letters, and so too is Marcion's Apostolikon, thought by some to be the earliest evidence of Pauline letters. So, and again, as you surely know, Bruce, the question the theories attempt to answer is how the letters, believed to have been sent far and wide and delivered to disparate ancient cities and regions, came together as a collection. All the theories rely on the situation of the Apostle Paul and the community recipients as found in the letters. That is, they trust in the historical reliability of the letter parties and the basic contours of the letter contents. Some of their baseline assumptions are as follows. The communities, designated without detailed specificity by region or city name alone, existed. The Christian faith was adopted early and spread to those ancient cities and regions designated by the letters. This happened even before the receipt of a letter from the Apostle Paul. The letters themselves are suggestive of this, as the apostle is seen to refine teachings and encourage progress in them. That is, the apostle addresses those who are depicted as already in the faith. Thirdly, the apostle Paul was recognized as being a significant spokesperson for the faithful, honored among them, so much so that in the earliest theories, his letters were prized and retained. Moreover, in those earliest theories, all the communities acted in lockstep, all carefully preserved their Pauline letter. So, given this situation, how are the letters then gathered into a group? How are they made into a collection? So, in the early collection theories, Christian adherents who were aware of the communities in the various ancient cities traveled to them, to those sites, knowing just where they were. They attained a copy of their Pauline letter and eventually accumulated them into a group. I'm somewhat simplifying, but not too much. Subsequent theories adopt the view that the Apostle Paul himself kept copies of his letters, and his disciples at a later period gathered them into a collection. Methodologically, however, these theories evince various problems. Significantly, they rely nearly exclusively on information internal to the letters themselves, while supplying no external verification. This pertains to the Apostle Paul, the communities, and the letters themselves. Without sufficient evidence, they assume burgeoning Christian communities or cells in the decades just after the death of Jesus. Yet this is an understanding that finds residence, I would argue, in the book of Acts, which is an idealized narrative of Christian origins. The earliest theories are likewise logistically problematic, for without specificity, how would the Christian cells have been located? Not considered is that addressees defined as recognizable ancient cities or regions is suggestive, or could likely be suggestive, of the widespread of the message into prominent places, echoing the symbolic use of cities as found in the embedded letters of Revelation, for example, where those cities taken together, those 7 cities of Revelation, to mean universality. They're not instances of historical data. Moreover, that the Apostle Paul's letters would have been recognized as significant depends on prior knowledge and even a high regard for Paul. Yet how would those communities have known the Apostle Paul? A high esteem for the Apostle Paul resonates, however, with modern understandings of him, based on the letters' presence in the canon, for example. That the Apostle Paul would have kept copies of his letters and his disciples attended to their gathering into a collection eases the situation of a collection, yet also requires some kind of institutional setting, like a school of Paul. Yet there's no evidence for the latter. That theory, too, appears to be based on later notions of the importance of those letters and the significance of the Apostle Paul. Recent scholarship has shown that there is no term for Christianity prior to the 2nd century. We see that in Acts and 1 Peter, for instance, undermining the notion of groups formed around Christian concepts. Moreover, the mid-1st century is a time assessed to be prior to the written Gospels, And it's there that we find articulations of the Christian faith. Thus, the authentic perspective is too early. It's depicted as being too early, as that perspective posits a time prior to
1 minute.
written gospels. So it's hard to reconcile these scenarios as found in the collection theories. The more I sit with the thesis, and I'm going to the end here, I find that it has better explanatory value than the authentic perspective. I find the letters are fictional, and fictional or literary letters allow for greater conceptual compatibility between all the various canonical textual types: Gospels, Acts, Apocalypse, and then add letters. Fictive letters readily accommodate recharacterization of figures, especially the inscribed sender. Events within letters need not be overly pressed for historical veracity.
Time.
Thank you. Sorry if it went on a little longer.
Oh no, it's fine. It was about 10 minutes, practically on the dot. All right, Bruce. I'll start the timer.
Okay. Thank you, Jacob. And thank you, Nina, very much for that very effective resume of the part of your argument that has to do with the way in which such a collection might have developed, an issue which I hope will indeed unfold itself further as the discussion continues. Another aspect of your book that I found extremely valuable and that I've wanted to call attention to for some time is the placement of the Pauline corpus, along with other elements of the New Testament, within the general framework of ancient literature, especially Greco Roman, but also broader than that. And that literature involves us in the whole question of pseudonymity, that documents which we can say at the moment appear quite clearly not to have been composed by the putative author were either accepted as such in antiquity or in antiquity came to have the authority of that particular writer. You draw our attention to similarities between the Pauline corpus on the one hand and the corpus of Plato and Seneca on the other hand. And this strikes me as a very important comparison in terms of certain formal elements of the letters. Also, because I think it does demonstrate, and I believe this should be accepted, it does demonstrate that the letter in antiquity could be a form of discourse, really quite unlike what we think of as being a letter. I was recently working on a project in which both Josephus and Philo refer to the interactions between King Agrippa I and Caligula. And one of them characterizes this as a personal conversation, and the other as a letter. And sure enough, the form of the discourse is remarkably similar. I think that conceptually speaking, we are dealing with a world in which the letter can have that kind of valence. So for me, this is one of the most interesting parts of your discussion. And the other is that, of course, Plato and Seneca are themselves troublesome figures from the point of view of pseudonymity. As it happens, we have finally had erupt at our classics department at Bard College a long simmering battle between those who want to accept the later sources of Seneca and those who do not, and those who want to accept the later sources of Plato and do not. I'm really quite struck by the elasticity of the argument involved as compared to what scholars of the New Testament might do. It seems to me in this regard, actually, we are a little bit more rigorous. And the feature that I think we need to bear in mind is that this pseudonymous tendency is by no means limited to the New Testament. It is often treated as if that's the case, owing to a background discussion of fundamentalism, often treated as if the New Testament is somehow special in having the question of pseudonymity come up. It isn't. It's a part of ancient literature, and not only Greco-Roman. I mean, let's think of what's being produced at the same time in Judaism in a way that can be compared to the New Testament. Let's think of the fourth book of Ezra, second book of Baruch, the so-called pseudo-philo, the Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum, all of which provide readings that can be compared to the Pauline corpus and to other parts of the New Testament, and are quite, if I may say, transparently pseudonymous. I don't think anyone believes Ezra wrote for Ezra, and so forth. I've just, as Jacob knows, completed a project in which we have cataloged the ways in which ancient Jewish literature in Aramaic, the Targumim, and rabbinic literature deal with scriptural texts from the canon of Israel and the way in which that can be compared to the New Testament. All of those resources are effectively pseudonymous in that they are held to be transmitted along chains of authority, which we can show, in fact, were not a part of the composition history. And then the scripture. Here we often, and I have to say, as if it is a matter of course, refer to the way in which scriptures of Israel have an impact on the New Testament, but those scriptures are themselves pseudonymous. Book of Isaiah can only be plausibly attributed to the 8th century prophet up until chapter 39, if you include middle 20s chapters, if you exclude middle 20s chapters. Thereafter, you have to think in terms of the second Isaiah, with its reference to Cyrus as being the anointed, the Messiah, and designated as such by God himself. So it's clear we're not talking about an 8th century setting whatsoever. And then later, from chapter 55, we have to think in terms of yet another setting, namely the return of exiles from Babylonia to Judea, which applies a time really quite later than Cyrus. And Ezekiel is not unlike this, and Zechariah is not unlike this. Ancient literature floats on a sea of pseudonymity. And that's the way in which it actually come in to be culturally influential. So the question is, and this is one reason I think why our classicists are right now at one another's throats, apart from the fact that that's what classicists do, it is that the question emerges when you know that something is pseudonymous, what does that tell you? Well, it tells you who didn't write it in one sense, but it also tells you that this particular document has used attribution in order to make a certain point. What is that point? What is that document actually about? What is pseudo about it is not so much the epigraphy as the name, the attribution. And I think that one aspect that we tend to lose sight of is that there's a tendency among scholars to imagine that if we settled questions of authorship, then that settles everything. It doesn't really, because that is only of use in helping us to understand the way in which this particular text has come into existence. And I'll give some examples. I'm not sure of my timing here, Jacob, but so don't hesitate to close me down when you have to.
You have close to 2 minutes.
Oh, that's great. So I'll come to examples, I think, later. But I, first of all, would like to point out that on the whole, the field hasn't done bad placing Paul within a context of pseudonymity. Yes, there's widespread agreement, and there is widespread agreement, that First Thessalonians, Galatians, First and Second Corinthians, Romans, Philippians, and Philemon ought to be treated as Pauline. Adela Collins recently does this in her book, Paul Transformed Forever. But what does that imply? Well, it implies that Colossians, Second Thessalonians, Ephesians, First Timothy, Second Timothy, Titus, and Hebrews are pseudonymous. Oh, and by the way, it doesn't stop there, because we also have extra-canonically Third Corinthians, named epistles to Laodiceans and Alexandrians, Acts of Paul, Paul of Thecla, a correspondence, imagine it, between Seneca and Paul, the Latin Apocalypse of Paul, and the Coptic Apocalypse of Paul. Now, they can't possibly all be authentic, and that represents a major advance in thinking, that we don't think of them all as being authentic. But what I would like to point out is, proportionally speaking, it is not as if the current consensus was developed out of an inattention to the whole issue of pseudonymity. Did I do okay on time?
Yeah, you have 8 seconds left.
Well, I'll yield my 8 seconds.
All right, Nina, for your for the first round of responses, you can begin your 10 minutes.
Thank you. I may not go 10 minutes. We'll see. I must say I loved a lot of what you said, Bruce. I wished I'd had you by my side. Some of the things you articulated were beautiful about pseudonymity. So thank you. I'll get a recording of this and keep track of that in that way now. So, yes, what I'd like to say, and following on what you've said about pseudonymity, we need to embrace pseudonymity. It does make a point about if you say that a letter of Paul is pseudonymous, then you have to ask the question, and I'm just going by what I've found you've said, why call it Paul? Then you need to ask that question, which moves scholarship along. By simply saying it's Paul, you basically have stopped any kind of further evaluation or scholarship. Well, it's settled. We know Paul wrote it. Okay, well, where do we go from here? And as you have said, Bruce, everything else we have from Paul is likely pseudonymous. So how does that fit? If we know some things are of Paul, okay, can't do anything more with those, but the rest of what we have from Paul is pseudonymous, and we can talk creatively about those other things. So yeah, I wanted to say the question of historicity basically stops the conversation. I do think there's a hang up, and I loved a lot of what you said about pseudonymity. But to me, the problem that I see within the field has to do with the genre. So when you talked about Ezra, these are books, right? They're not letters. So there's a hang up, I think, because it's a letter. So this is what I think is behind a lot of the authenticity issue with the letter and the resistance. It's because a letter, more so than a book that's already in the Hebrew Bible or other kinds of books that we might have, a letter seems more realistic, more honest. I have said in my book that is a rhetorical move to use a letter because it seems real. You can do a lot with it now. You can be creative, because it seems like you have something real, and that becomes more powerful, especially when it's attributed to a figure like Paul, who's made into an apostle. So this rhetorical use of a letter, and I kind of wove around a little bit in my response, but got a few points out, perhaps enough for you to respond, perhaps.
All right,
I'm
Bruce.
ceding the rest of my time.
All right. See, we're both creative in our use of time. That's great. I'd like, if I may, to pick up your comment about talking creatively about other things when we're dealing with the parts of the literature, whichever parts we think are pseudonymous, as being pseudonymous. And I just want to emphasize how important that is in dealing with this particular corpus, because key passages of what is agreed to be pseudonymously Pauline have exerted an enormous impact on the development of early Christian thinking. So that I think, and I'll refer to this, I think, probably later on in a different context, I'm thinking of the presentation of Christ dying in Hebrews chapter 9 as being his entry into the heavenly holy places, such that there's understood to be a Platonic correspondence between the shadow of those realities, which is held to be the temple in Jerusalem, and the permanent holy place, which is held to be celestial. Now, that kind of typology can be related to other Pauline letters, there's no question about it. On the other hand, the fully transparent cosmological Platonism of Hebrews marks an especially important moment in the development of early Christian thinking, especially because then that entry of Christ, as it is portrayed, into the heavenly sanctuary is what is held to have produced the possibility of forgiveness. Now, this conception stays with Christianity not only in its theology, but also in its presentation of Christ's sacrifice in the Eucharist. It will be heavily developed by Cyprian of Carthage, but then just be a part of the furniture of early Christian thinking until the time when, in the Middle Ages, Aristotle will come and take the relief of Plato. Even then, I have to say, I don't believe for a moment that we can speak of the eclipse of Platonic thinking in Christianity. But this shift is more thoroughly accomplished in Hebrews than it is in any other New Testament writing. And so, in that context, I believe I can understand why it attempts to pass as a Pauline statement. That is, it wants to take what the author knows of the position of Paul in regard to forgiveness and make it into this conception of a Platonic sacrifice. But if you don't factor that into the development of early Christian thought, I don't think it's possible really to understand what happens second century and subsequent to that. Similarly, Ephesians is the one letter that asserts a kind of claim about Christian unity within one Lord, one faith, one baptism, which it is held actually transcends the distinction between Jew and Greek, so that the wall of partition, it is claimed, is shattered that separated them. Well, I think anyone reading other Pauline letters would not think of that partition as being demolished by what is going on. Something new, something fresh, interesting is going on in Ephesians, and it is also producing a claim for the unity within the faith, which in turn makes the faith much less tolerant of those who are not a part of it. So I'm not claiming for a moment that these are progressive changes or that these are correct changes, But there are moments in the history of pseudonymity where one can see them making a contribution. Uh, it helps us to see that there is an important distinction, and I think your history of discussion helps one to perceive this. There's a distinction between what you have to say about authorship and whether something is a part of the canon, and in turn, whether it exerts an influence. It might not be in the canon at all, and yet exert an influence. On the other hand, one might think it's quite obvious, as I think it is with Hebrews and Ephesians, that these are post Pauline writings. Of course, it is true that there's always room for argument. So, for example, there was a review of Adela Collins's book, Paul Transformed, where the reviewer, Stefan Krauter, made the observation, gee, the picture would be different if we saw Colossians and Second Thessalonians as being authentic. Well, he's right, but he never explains why we should, and I'm sure he will in due course. He's writing a commentary just now on the pastorals. But it is different, and I was, I have to say, pleased by that, because I also allow for some elements of Paul within Colossians. But on Second Thessalonians, I don't see that at all. And I'll give an example later on why I don't see that as being the same. On the issue of the letter as being chosen because it's more realistic, I think that is generally the case. And the example that I gave from the writings of Josephus and Philo, I think tends towards the same direction. It's very interesting that the book of Acts has James, the brother of Jesus, sending a letter. Who would have thought of that? Why should you include the letter and quote it in the way that you do? I think Acts sees this as adding a element of verisimilitude to what is being said. Incidentally, in that regard, when this letter is sent in Acts chapter 15, it is accompanied by emissaries who are sent out from James, one of whom is Silas, also known as Silvanus, who can be associated with Paul. And in the course of that, when they refer to them strengthening the community in association with this letter, prophesying alongside it, they use the verb episterizo. I've just begun a project on the book of Acts. I'm just interested by the choice of the word episterizo with a preposition instead of simply sterizo, which is already there in Luke. And I wonder if it refers in particular to the way in which you understand there to be a interface between oral communication and the letter form, which is to suggest that it's also possible to think creatively about materials that are authentic. There's no reason in the world why the finding of authenticity should shut down historical analysis. I agree that does happen, but I think that does happen because of the confusion between something being historic and something being canonical, but a confusion this time which occurs in a different way. Certainly, these are all, I think, examples of living communication, even when, and in fact, especially when, they are stylized communications. I think most of us know when you get a letter that is expressed with a strong point of view. It is not necessarily a direct apprehension of reality. And you have to ask, well, why is this being written at all? Why is it present?
1 minute.
And that's one of the ways in which it's possible to falsify a document in terms of attribution, but then that falsification itself becomes a part of the impact that it exerts over time. Do I have another 8 seconds?
He
You
wants
had
to make them
you had
up.
like 80. I think you had like 40 seconds actually.
Oh, I
40
did. Okay,
seconds.
well, that's fine. No, that's good. That's good.
Okay. All right. For the second round of responses, Nina, you can begin.
Uh, well, I appreciate what you said about the worth of Hebrews for theology, and also and the importance it has had on the Christian tradition, and also for Ephesians, those two letters which um, are generally thought of as pseudonymous if you still hold to the seven authentic letters thesis, right? Um, it seems to me too that you're following a little bit of a generational way of looking at things. In other words, the seven authentic letters are an original group where you have Paul's early teachings, earlier thoughts, and then progressively other the letters are added on, and you have notions of institutionalization, more theory that doesn't necessarily line up with the centrality of something like justification by faith, that is thought to hold those authentic letters together. Um, I haven't investigated thoroughly um, how that generational theory could be disturbed, but I have a sense in which it could be disturbed to such an extent that you could imagine or um, credibly ascertain and put forward an argument that a group of letters, like those 10 letters that Marcion compiled, all came together. They were all done around the same time, maybe within a year or two of each other. And then when Marcion, well, in my theory, I'm thinking it was probably somebody like Marcion, because with him we have those 10 letters. He got all of his group together and he said, okay, we got enough now. And we have also represented seven different communities, which is also handy. I think that that is playing a role too somehow. Let's publish those together. So I don't necessarily think that you have to have a generational theory, something later, something more rarefied, like Hebrews, Platonic thought, and all of these things that gradually grows on an earlier thought. Um, as I said, I haven't investigated that thoroughly, but I think it could be put forward for more analysis in the future. Um, you want to stay with the authentic letters, and I get that. I mean, it's what I'm putting forward is different. It's a paradigm that's not often spoken about. It's different. I will tell you, I have been sitting with this since 2018. For me, I'm much more comfortable with it. And as I said at the end of my first 10 minutes, I had another paragraph in there, but I jumped over it. I do feel comfortable with my thesis. Um, and some of it, as you know from reading the book, is how do we have an apostle Paul to write letters in the first place? That I think is a problem in the authentic perspective. Paul seems to come out of nowhere. Okay, how is that, and how can those letters then be recognized, which is what I alluded to a little bit in the collection theories. The community's got the letter and they already said, hey, we've got a letter from the Apostle Paul. Well, how is that if we don't have a concept of the Apostle Paul? And in my view, that comes from literature. It's the literature that gives us the Apostle Paul. And then the letters are enabled, because that's what good letters do, especially pseudonymous letters, coming back to what you have focused on originally, Bruce. Pseudonymous letters, they're pros at that. Pros at taking a character and re-articulating that character. I'll say he, because almost all of these pseudonymous letters are by males. I haven't encountered a female collection. So that fits. It fits nicely. It fits squarely with a problematic that is not acknowledged of how you come to get the Apostle Paul. I'll stop there.
All right, Bruce, 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. As we look into this question of whether there is development among the letters, which I think I would prefer as language rather than generational. Whenever I speak
Okay,
of
good.
generational, it makes me feel old. So I'd rather speak of development instead. And I think, as you rightly say, it has long been recognized that it appears that references to people who have authority in churches and use of the term ecclesia begins to modulate over time. And that this is a much more prominent concern, especially in the famous pastoral epistles, which, by the way, seem to me much better to fit the Senecan fictive letter, in the sense of a letter to a person being exactly when it's really not a letter to a person. It's rather intending to make a far more general statement. So I would take that as a case where an agreed upon pseudonymous letter is in that position. But I'd like to concentrate on something which I personally find more interesting, because it comes into my orientation in reading these letters. In other words, how it is that what appear to be later letters attempt to resolve issues that are problematic that emerge from what appear to be earlier letters. I'll just give a couple examples of this. There are many more that might be investigated. The statement that's made in 1 Timothy 1:8, we know that the law is good if one makes use of it lawfully. Wouldn't life have been easier in the audiences of Romans and Galatians and 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians if this were available as a synopsis of Paul's own position? But as we know, his own relationship to the Torah, understood as law, is far more twisted and complicated than that. I just give the one example of Romans 3:28 as a kind of classic statement. We consider a person to be made just by faith apart from deeds of the law, very famously, after he's just said that, in fact, the law has predictive force in understanding this faith. First Timothy manages entirely to bracket out that kind of consideration. Similarly, I already referred to the usage of temple imagery in Hebrews chapter 9, to the point that at that point in verse 24, the author can say Christ did not enter into holy places that are copies of the true, but into heaven itself. Well, this stands in some contrast to what the writer, whoever that writer might be, of Romans 15:16 says, when he refers to himself. Yeah, it really is masculine anyway in the Greek, so we can't get away from it. I agree with you. Refer to himself as in the officiant of Jesus Christ for the Gentiles, doing the priestly work of the message, so that the offering of the Gentiles might be acceptable, sanctified by the Holy Spirit. And then he says, and I'm going now to Jerusalem, where there's a temple functioning, apparently within the worldview of that letter. And then to give an example from Second Thessalonians, and this is why I don't agree with the idea of Stefan Krauter that Second Thessalonians should be put within this group of, let me just call them prior letters for the moment. You have this statement in Second Thessalonians 2:2, do not be easily shaken in mind or alarmed by spirit or word or letter, as if from us that the day of the Lord has arrived. And so Second Thessalonians commits itself to the elongated understanding of apocalypse, which of course, will eventually be perfected in the work called the apocalypse. Now, why would you ever think that someone could read Paul and think that the day of the Lord has already arrived? Why? Because he said exactly that kind of thing in 1 Corinthians, when he speaks of the schema, the form of this world as already passing away. Now, I'll fully agree with you, completely agree with you, that this kind of development doesn't show who the author is of the previous statements, which are being amended at the later stage. There might be a development of a completely fictive author. But is that likely? The other examples of pseudonymity that we've referred to in other forms of ancient literatures, on the whole, develop out of some corpus that existed. At times, where I have to agree is, at times, the linkage might be very slight. For example, I don't believe for a moment that there's much Enoch in the Enochic tradition. And yet it grew very spectacularly from the 3rd century before the Common Era until the 2nd century of the Common Era. And by the way, it includes a letter. So yes, there are examples in which one might develop that kind of understanding, but in any case, you're dealing with a developmental trajectory, which I think exegetically we want to make sure that we can do justice to, because at the end of the day, the winning argument, as you know, in any analysis that involves exegesis is what better explains the text. And that's the position I find myself in.
Okay.
You way the waste of your time?
Indeed, yes.
Okay.
Yes, sure.
So now we're going to enter the dialogue phase. So you can both ask each other questions, perhaps maybe ask what would convince the other of their view. We start now.
So, what would it take to convince you? I could ask that
Well,
question.
I was quite taken by your earlier question. Basically, where did Paul come from? And, the book of Acts would like to answer that question. Paul came from friendship with Barnabas, that Barnabas is the prior apostle, which in effect answers a mystery with a mystery, namely, well, where does Barnabas come within this whole trajectory? Does seem to be the case that the term apostolos is used rather more loosely in Acts, but also, for that matter, also in the Pauline corpus, than we might expect if there was any kind of fixity about that understanding. So I agree with you with the point that you made more in the book than in our discussion, that the picture, as in Deisman, of Paul as this great charismatic figure is a bit much. I mean, one thing I would say that comes out of these letters referred to as authentic is that this is not a charismatic personality that actually produces this work. One can easily understand when he refers to opposition why there was opposition to him. On the other hand, there is also a mastery of Judaic tradition, which is deployed in order to make his overall, at the end of the day, prophetic case as to what it is that his particular evangelion stands for. So I am not too troubled by the inability of New Testament sources to give us Paul's background, apart from the snippets that they do, nor does it actually bother me. Let's say, why doesn't Josephus mention him? Well, why exactly should Josephus mention him? Why doesn't he come up in Roman historians? Well, he's too insignificant. There are many cases within this literature and within Judaic literature where the references have to be built up on the basis of internal indications. And again, in that instance, one operates on the basis of inference as to whether the best possible explanation has been achieved. So I have a question. Would it really
Okay.
hurt you if he wrote anything that we have? I mean, let's say we
Um,
went back to F.C. Bauer. Let's say it's only those four. Would you be happier with that?
that's a good question. Um, I I think that it still creates the problems to have letters that are written by the Apostle Paul. For me, it would still create problems.
Mm-hmm.
Problems because of how I'm now looking at the letters, um, that don't, which is something we haven't talked about here, they don't even look so much like real letters, especially the
Mm-hmm.
canonical
Mm-hmm.
letters, the form of those letters.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another whole issue there. And also, the rhetorical sense of the letters seems to be more powerful to me now than the historical
Mm-hmm.
letter actually going out and being somehow genuine correspondence. I don't see how that will line up well. And that goes back to what I said earlier with regard to collection theories.
Mm-hmm.
Too many things for me, based on my research, just don't line up
Mm-hmm.
well. And in terms of Paul and how we know of Paul, um, I think um, we know of Paul, who was formerly Saul, and there was something very important to change that to become a Roman character, a Paulus,
Mm-hmm.
who has a Roman name.
Mm-hmm.
So we would lose some of that interesting signification, um, spiraling back to the authentic perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I would
But,
answer that. I
mm-hmm.
would probably, as I told Jacob prior to the debate, I will probably tomorrow at this time think of a much better response to your
Oh,
question than I
right.
can think of right now off the top of my head.
This already,
That's
this
how it
already.
is with me. It's tough.
No, it's fair enough that goes on. I have to say, I agree about your rhetorical comment. That is, I also think that authentic letters are often rhetorical.
Yes.
and that Paul's are. And a lot depends on what kind of rhetorical situation one is addressing. So I mentioned Adela Collins's book. There she makes that a case that Markian, in particular, is appropriating what Paul says about sexuality and applying it in a different way. In other words, she there, within her reception history, is speaking of this in terms of development. And I think
Hmm.
myself, this is perhaps one area in which I disagree with the finding of your book. Uh, I think that the argument about circumcision does not have to await the Bar Kokhba War to emerge, because we have very good evidence of what I would call Roman Judeophobia over the particular issue of circumcision, and that problem emerging prior to the breakout of the Bar Kokhba revolt, especially, for example, in the satires of Juvenal.
Hmm.
And we can also see it in the practices of the family of Herod the Great. Uh, the women of Herod the Great's family were usually insistent that anyone they married should be circumcised, so that if someone was not circumcised, he had to go through that procedure prior. So King Polemon of Cilicia has himself circumcised so that he can marry Berenice, Herod the Great's great granddaughter. All fine. But something very interesting also happens. Her sister, Drusilla, marries Felix, the procurator, and he doesn't circumcise. And Berenice herself, after leaving Polemon, because that didn't work out, has a long standing affair with Titus, the general and future emperor, who, of course, also does not go through circumcision. So the understanding of a kind of Roman horror at circumcision is something which I think does not have to, it doesn't await the Bar Kokhba revolt. Without question at all, thinkers such as Justin Martyr now take this to be evidence that it's over, that all
Hmm.
Judaism has now come to an end. I mean, that revolt was without doubt, and I think this is an important feature of your book, was without doubt a deeper influence on Christian ideology than was the destruction of the temple in 70. But I don't have a problem seeing a Galatians taking up a attitude towards circumcision, very much like that, which I can see also among Roman writers of the period.
Of an earlier period,
Yeah,
you're
of an early,
saying.
yeah, that's right.
Hmm.
In other words, it does work prior to the second century.
Yeah. Um,
That there's a rhetorical situation then towards which I think the rhetoric is targeted.
yeah. And I've seen those issues, and I see also a certain discomfort with circumcision in some of those sources that you've mentioned and the discussion of circumcision. But this um, do not become circumcised, which I find in Galatians is quite strong. How does it become so strong? I would argue is an apologetic. Um, there's an apology going on there. And then you have to ask, why is there an apology happening? And
Hmm.
that I think is Roman rule that is behind an apologetic attitude towards circumcision. Um, so I don't know. I think we differ there
Hmm.
in
Yeah.
terms of
Hmm.
the degree in degree attitudes
Exactly. And I think
towards circumcision. There's
I
a
think,
problematic there.
yeah, I think it's a question of degree, and also a degree of difference over who you're telling not to circumcise.
Hmm.
That is, are you saying, look, if you're a Gentile, do not circumcise, which according to the Book of Acts, is not the unique position of Paul? Or are you saying, in fact, circumcision is all over, along with the destruction of the temple? Now that, I think, is a key difference. And as far as I can see, it's a difference that emerges during the course of the 2nd century. Totally agree with that. And I do think that the Bar Kokhba War is central to that development.
And so I put the letters there.
I know that, and that's exactly why I don't. In the case of Galatians and Romans, sort of taking the lead on that issue. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's a difference in how we're reading it.
Exactly.
Which
right.
It's to be understood amongst two scholars.
It's been known to, known to happen. Exactly.
Exactly.
Well, Nina and Bruce, I want to thank you both for joining me today and having this debate here on History Valley. And I'd like to remind everybody the links to purchase Rabbi Paul and the letters of Paul in their Roman literary context will be in descriptions below and in the pinned comment. With that being said, Nina and Bruce, thank you both.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Good to meet you.
It's been a pleasure for me too.
Even virtually.
Good to meet you too, Bruce. Thank you.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.